when you look at the strategic side of clandestine activity, particularly covert action, I would say there have been no strategic successes that I could think of, and very serious strategic failures. And when you look particularly at one area, since we were involved in one of the worst presidential decisions ever made, if not the worst, the decision to go into Iraq, which essentially turned on the whole issue of regime change. Here, when you look at the CIA experience with regime change, that should have given enough reason or evidence for any government, any administration, to avoid the kind of thing that George Bush got involved in March 2003. That is, when you look at the CIA experience over the years in Iran, in Chile, in Cuba, in the Congo, in Vietnam, and which led to the assassination of Diem, there's been nothing but a continuous pattern of failure of regime change. And of course, Baghdad and the venture and the use of force in Iraq was really about regime change more than it was anything else, in my estimation. Some people have called that the most profligate decision any American president has ever made. I tend to agree with that. But I think it's very dangerous to overestimate, which we have done, the whole role of clandestine behavior. We have put too much stock on what human intelligence gives us. Remember, that's the kind of intelligence that we gather from individual assets that is supposed to give you some idea of the intentions of other leaders in other societies. And when you look at the tactical intelligence failures that I recited, obviously we did a very poor job of understanding the intentions of a Khrushchev or a Sadat or a Khomeini, or look at any of the intelligence failures when we really didn't have good collection on the intentions of the other side or particularly important leaders in terms of the threat they represented to the interests of the United States. To go back to intelligence for a minute before I get into some issues of reform and what needs to be done with regard to the CIA, I think it is important to look at this issue of failure because I think it's extremely important to have a CIA but to get it right. And clearly right now we don't have it right. There have been basically two kinds of intelligence failure over the years. There's been the classic failure, which is the failure of assumptions, that if your assumptions are wrong, no matter how good your intelligence is, it really isn't going to matter in the final analysis. And then there is the problem of politicized intelligence, when sometimes your evidence is pretty good, but for reasons of political pressure, again, the run-up to the war in Iraq, intelligence gets spun or tailored or fixed somehow to policy, and this leads you to a major intelligence failure. The classic failures, I think, are well known. Pearl Harbor was one of those classic failures, in which the intelligence was there to anticipate that there was going to be a Japanese attack against United States interests. We didn't have any intelligence that pinpointed Pearl Harbor, but we certainly knew the Japanese, because we had broken the military code, that they were going to break relations with the United States, that their embassy was told to destroy all their sensitive papers and codes dealing with the United States, that the Japanese fleet was out in international waters where it couldn't be tracked, and some warning should have gone to the Philippines and to Pearl Harbor, but it didn't. The October War was another case in 1973 that not only did the CIA fail, but Israeli intelligence, Mossad, failed terribly, and that was their Pearl Harbor. Because again, I think there was sufficient intelligence to tell us that Egypt, and in this case Egypt, and indeed Syria, would combine to attack Israel in a surprise attack. Maybe not the very day that the attack took place, but that this indeed was coming. And 72 hours before that attack, we had broken the message, this was the job of the National Security Agency, that in which the Soviets told their people in Egypt and Syria to withdraw all their non-essential personnel, their families, and even some of their military technicians, which is a classic indicator of war. And certainly, if nothing else, there should have been 72 hours of warning, because that information was also shared with the Israelis, 72 hours of warning before the attack took place. On politicized intelligence, I would think the classic examples would be the failure to monitor and track the decline of the Soviet Union throughout the period of the 1980s, leading to the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, and of course the misuse of intelligence leading up to the Iraq War in March 2003. In the case of the Soviet Union, the politics of this, I think, were fairly obvious. You had a very ideological president, Ronald Reagan, who wanted to rebuild the military and double the spending of the Defense Department, and he wanted the intelligence to support that decision. That meant that all of the intelligence on the Soviet Union had to prove somehow that the Soviet Union indeed was 10 feet tall and a serious threat that had to be met. He introduced a very political CIA director, the first time a political individual. So this was Bill Casey, who was one of the directors of the Reagan political campaign in 1980, to be the CIA director. Casey, in turn, took a CIA official by the name of Robert Gates, who is now the Secretary of Defense, made him his special assistant in 81, his deputy director for intelligence in 83, and the deputy director of the entire CIA in 1985. And they proceeded over a period from 1981 until Casey's death in 1987 to politicize intelligence to the point that when the Soviet Union collapsed, you had people as important as President Bush, Secretary of, well, actually the National Security Advisor and the Chairman of Joint Chiefs, Colin Powell, and the National Security Advisor, Fred Scowcroft, saying they had no warning whatsoever from the Central Intelligence Agency, not so much about the collapse of the Soviet Union, but even the weakness of the Soviet Union. So that indeed was a major intelligence failure in which politicization played a major part. In the run-up to the Iraq War, if you look at all of the major pieces of evidence that were used to make the case for war, clearly every piece of evidence was somehow politicized, some of it more than others. If you go back to the State of the Union speech that President Bush gave in January of 2003, January, I think, 28th, 2003, and the famous 16 words about the British had learned that Iraq was obtained highly enriched uranium from Britain, that was based on an intelligence fabrication, a document that apparently was put together by Italian military intelligence sources. They tried to sell it to an Italian magazine, which wasn't buying it because the editor of the magazine recognized the document as a fabrication. But then it got to British intelligence, French intelligence, and finally American intelligence. And even though there were efforts on the part of the CIA, in this case, to inform the National Security Council that indeed this was a fabrication, it ended up with the President's State of the Union message. A week or so later, Secretary of State Colin Powell gave a speech at the United Nations that was clearly the case for war to take not only to the American people, but to the entire international community. And I don't know about the newspapers that you read on a regular basis, but I read the Washington Post every day. And the day after that speech, there were 7 editorials and op-eds in the Washington Post, and every one took up Secretary of State Colin Powell's argument and basically said, yes, the United States now has a case to go to war. And the most liberal writer on that page, the late Mary McGrory, I remember her column was entitled, I'm Persuaded. This was a case that was made out of 28 allegations, all of them false, and a speech that was written for him at CIA headquarters in which the director of CIA, George Tenet, and the deputy director, John McLaughlin, took part in the writing of that speech. George Tenet wrote his memoir, finished it nearly a year ago. It's been sitting in CIA being reviewed and challenged, and I assume redacted in part by the CIA, but this month it will be published. I'm very interested to see what interpretation George Tenet will give to his role in helping to write and vet the speech the Secretary of State Colin Powell gave in February of 2003.